Thank you for joining us for our 5th Forum on Women in Ministry. My name is Kirsten Oh. I teach practical theology here in the Undergraduate School of Theology. The Forum on Women in Ministry started in 2015, so you are attending the 5th iteration of the Forum on Women in Ministry. Let me give you a brief history of the type of conversations we've had in the last 4 years. So in spring of 2015, we had Karen Winslow, Dr. Karen Winslow, who teaches biblical studies, am I saying that right, or Hebrew Bible, in the Graduate School of Theology at Azusa Pacific Seminary here, on feminism then and now. And myself spoke about casting my lot with Lot's wife, a rereading of the text on Lot's wife. And we had a special speaker named Dr. Haley Gray Scott, who spoke about the myth of exceptional women. Now, our intention from spring 2015 is to always hold these women's forum on the month that is historically the Women's History Month. And so we are currently in the month of March, which has been the Women's History Month to celebrate not only women in general, but particularly women in theology and biblical studies. Then in spring 2016, we talked about our own journey, our own stories, with the theme, Stories, Yours and Ours. Again, Dr. Karen Winslow, myself, and we added Dr. Janette H, who teaches New Testament at Azusa Pacific Seminary. Then in 2017, we had a Azusa Pacific Seminary student named Nikki Ramage speak about her paper on Tamar with the theme, Making Space for Tamar, Sexual Assault, Then and Now. And both Dr. Janette and myself responded to that very difficult and challenging text of terror, while Dr. Karen Winslow moderated at that section. Then in spring 2018, we had Behold Her Body, Pursuing and Policing Female Sexuality, featuring Dr. Alice Yafade, who teaches New Testament in the undergraduate section of the School of Theology. And there she particularly talked about Cameroon and mutilating bodies, particularly female bodies. And Dr. Janette and I responded to that while Dr. Winslow moderated that section. And then today, we have our 5th Forum on Women in Ministry, featuring Dr. K. Higuera Smith. Let's welcome Dr. Higuera Smith. She will be speaking to us about Mary of Nazareth, Prophetess and Protagonist. And we are really in for a treat because she has been actually researching on this topic for over a decade now. Let me then briefly give you an introduction to Dr. Smith. K. Higuera Smith is a professor of biblical and religious studies and program director of the Religious Studies minor program at Azusa Pacific University. She writes about social justice issues as they relate to critical gender theory, post-coloniality, and evangelicalism. In her most recent publications, she was editor-in-chief of Post-Colonial Evangelical Conversations, Global Awakenings in Theology and Praxis. She currently has 2 books under contract, one on the historical figure of Mary of Nazareth, which she is presenting to us today, and another on Latinx biblical hermeneutics. Please welcome Dr. K. Higuera Smith to the podium.
Thank you. It's good to see you all. Why are we talking about Mary of Nazareth when we're dealing with a forum on women in ministry? Primarily because we have been told, many of us our whole lives, that there were no precedents for women doing ministry in the earliest generations of the Jesus movement. And we have been told that women were to be sublimated, and then it was actually a God-ordained social hierarchy that virtually half the human population was ordained by God to subordinate themselves to another half of the human population, which, when that argument was cast in terms of race, we roundly rejected the idea that human beings were called by God, were demanded, required by God because of God's natural order to subordinate themselves under another class of human beings. We find that abhorrent now. And yet, for reasons beyond my understanding, except that I know how ideologies work, we maintain that notion today. And it's a notion that I hope through the Holy Spirit that gets crushed, because it is a notion that crushes the Holy Spirit. And our discussion about Mary of Nazareth today will help us understand to what lengths church tradition has gone to erase and destroy the evidence of her active ministry in the earliest communities of Jesus followers, and that's really important. I began this work actually because I'm a biblical scholar, not a church historian. I began looking at this just within the texts of the canonical Gospels themselves, because I was asking certain sets of questions about signs and symbols that we'll discuss in a minute. And I became convinced through my own research that Mary was indeed a much more formidable figure than the tradition had given her credit for. However, it was so subtle, and it was so difficult to nail down with confidence. I really needed a smoking gun. I needed evidence. And about 4 or 5 years ago, at a conference, I met a scholar named Allie Cattouse. I'm going to be quoting from her pretty extensively today, because Allie and I were digging a tunnel, and we were aiming towards the same direction, but we didn't know it. So when we found each other and we began to take one another's research seriously, we became very excited, because she was examining artwork, she was examining ancient texts that had been suppressed and had been recopied in ways that erased Mary's agency. And with her work and mine together, I think we have now a very, very strong case to argue strongly that Mary indeed was acting in all forms of ministry: healing, baptizing, teaching men, preaching, carrying out exorcisms, and even very likely officiating at the Eucharist. These are all activities that we associate with ministry, and these are all activities that the tradition has remembered Mary of Nazareth as carrying out. So we're going to start backwards in a way. We're going to start with the history so that we can just have a very brief overview of the ways that these traditions get buried, erased, rewritten by the later tradition, who find them implausible. Now, I see some of my former students in here, and anyone who has taken my class, Women in the Biblical Tradition, knows that there are many cases within the canonical writings themselves where we have very clear evidence that particular words were translated in certain ways, were in order to suppress or cover over the agency of the women figures. This happened, we can see it very clearly in our study of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, but it's also very easy to track in history, and this is how it works. You have an ancient text that refers to Mary of Nazareth carrying out all these various functions that we would associate with ministry, and then you get a later version of that same text. And if you read both of them carefully, lo and behold, what you discover is the later version changes it. And now Mary isn't doing the Eucharist anymore. Now Mary isn't being, doesn't have the apostles bowing down to her anymore. Now she's bowing down to the apostles. So you can actually track this so that it's beyond doubt that the tradition has changed these writings. Where we find the strongest evidence for Marian veneration, or the veneration of Mary, is in the liturgical texts of the Eastern churches, the Syriac churches, and some interesting recent writings have surfaced in the Georgian language, in what is today Georgia. So you're talking Eastern, almost to very, very far east to Georgia. This is where these traditions have been remembered about Mary. And many of them we have not had in translation until just very, very recently, some of them within the last decade or so. So this helps us realize why it's taken us so long. One of the things, let me tell you some of the research questions that led me to begin asking questions about Mary. I began wondering about family. Those of us who study the New Testament from a social scientific perspective know that kinship is a really important indicator for social identity in the ancient Mediterranean world. One of the primary ways that people understood their own identity was in relation to a kin group. And as I was reading Mark chapter 3, where there's a narrative where Jesus, Mary, and the brothers come to Jesus, and they're outside, they're seeking for him, and Jesus, in a way that seems very cold, actually, says, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And he looks around at the people who are inside with him, and he says, "These are my mothers and my brothers and my sisters." So the tradition has always argued that Jesus has overturned traditional kinship relationships at that point, and that thereafter created what we call a fictive kinship group. That is a new kinship group that has been constructed not by blood relation but by other criteria. So I'm thinking, well, if that's the case, what's going on in Acts, where the very first leader of the assembly in Acts is Jesus' brother? That's a kinship move. And not only that, but the writer of Acts, who jumps through hoops trying to help us validate Paul's claims to authority, seems to take James's claim, Jesus' brother, for granted. He makes no effort to try to justify or legitimize James's claims to authority, to the extent that when we come to Acts chapter 15 and there is a dispute, Peter operates as an advocate for a certain argument, and ultimately James is essentially what we would call the judge. He makes the final authority, the final decision unilaterally. He says, "Therefore, I determine," and he makes his determination. So if kinship doesn't matter, traditional kinship, why does kinship matter? And then I began to notice other things. I began to notice the way that Mary gets named by Mark, and that Mark is quite hostile to her. What's going on here? So as I go through, I'll explain to you the process that these research questions led to me. But a research question for those of you who are students is how any project gets started. You see anomalies in the text. You see things that don't fit, that don't go together. And you say, what's going on here? Why do you have this and this? And they seem to contradict each other. what does this tell us? Is it significant? So this tells you a little bit about my journey. Let me get into the work itself. My argument that I'm going to be making is that Mary of Nazareth was one of the most prominent leaders among the ancient followers of Jesus, but that later scribes changed and omitted texts that name her and describe her leadership role, and they do it in order to suppress that leadership role. And yet, if we look very carefully, kind of like an archaeologist who's studying things that have been covered over with dirt, that's what we do as textual analysts, we can find that even the canonical Gospels give evidence to support later texts that attest to her being this formidable figure. So in ancient church tradition, Mary is remembered for many things. That is, in literature that comes after our canonical Gospels, our Gospels that are in the canon of the New Testament. She's remembered as an exorcist, a preacher, a disputant, a teacher, a healer, a liturgist, a prayer leader, an apostle to the apostles. Now, if you ask me, that qualifies her for being a minister, wouldn't you say? I think she's done enough to meet that bar. There's some really interesting examples, and one of the most interesting is a 5th century liturgical text called the Transitus Mariae that was discovered in around the 1920s, and it was translated by a woman named Agnes Lewis, and we do have it in English translation. And why it's important is because we have other translations from later texts that are dated to a later tradition, and so we can compare Lewis's translation and these later translations and see the changes. So for instance, if we look at Mary as exorcist, and I'm not going to have time to read all of these to you, but there's this fascinating story about Mary carrying out an exorcism. She sealed, which is a type of anointing done with water or oil. So here you have her anointing, either with water or oil. She sealed with water in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, a woman who was possessed by a demon who would always strangle her. Then, along with the leprous woman mentioned below, sprinkled them both with water. So here you have her carrying out an exorcism and performing unction on those people. Now, 2 later editions, one edited by William Wright, and another Ethiopic edition. The Ethiopic edition removes the sprinkling of water when they tell the same story, but they retain the healing. William Wright's edition removes all the elements of exorcism, just stating that Mary prayed over the woman. So here you see a great discomfort with Mary carrying out all these activities, and the edition that was translated by Wright just removing all of that uncomfortable information. And here again, this is hard evidence. We have these texts in front of us, and we can look at them and compare them. The same happened with the discussions of Mary as preacher and disputant and teacher. In the Transitus Mariae, Mary, quote, commands the governor of Jerusalem to sit down, and then she preaches the gospel to him. Wright's version and the Ethiopic version, they just remove that completely out of the story. In another one, quote, she disputes with priests, telling them, I will not do your bidding, and I will not listen to your words, and I will not do your will. Wright's edition took it out. A little uncomfortable. Women came from dozens of cities throughout the Roman Empire, and, quote, she taught them whatever they asked her, and she taught the women who lived with her everything. In Liber Requii, a Dormition text, Mary gives the women writings. So we have a tradition that she actually wrote devotional material, gave it to the women to take back to their homes so that others might believe. Wright completely removes the scene. The Ethiopic 6 books exchanges the writings, with the word writings, with a sweet and beautiful fragrance. So as you go through and you compare these, you get pretty cynical with what they're doing. They are very straightforwardly just transforming the text to make it fit with their ideologies rather than what the earlier traditions are saying. There is evidence that she was a healer. In Transitus Mariae, Mary cured, quote, 2,800 souls, men, women, and children. Another place, quote, she stretched out her hand and touched a woman's right eye who was blind. By the way, notice the similar language to the healing narratives of Jesus. In another one, she healed a woman from strangury. I had to look that up. It's kind of like kidney stones. In another one, she healed a boy with elephantiasis. In another, she sealed one boy who had severe pains and healed him. So here you have very active evidence of her being a healer. She is also recorded as a liturgist. In the book of the Resurrection of Christ, it states the apostles and kissed and blessed the apostle Bartholomew. And then with Mary, they offered the Eucharist. In another one, in Transitus Mariae, she sealed and sprinkled with water a demon-possessed woman and a woman with leprosy, healing both in the process. In another, Mary had a censer. A censer is an incense holder, which priests would use in the temple, of sweet spices and myrrh, and she was many times depicted burning incense. Very common to have Mary depicted as burning incense with a burning censer. These are all liturgical acts. She was a prayer leader, Transitus Mariae again. And when my Lady Mary, now when we hear the word lady, we have to realize that in the Syriac, it should be considered similar to how we would understand Lord. That is, mistress, my master. My master, Mary, heard these things. This was the testimony of some of the travelers from the apostles. She stretched out her hands to heaven and prayed. And after Mary had prayed, the apostles set forth the censer of incense and knelt down with their faces down and prayed. So you have Mary standing in prayer as an orans in the figure, a very common figure of a woman either with her hands raised in a priestly benediction or her hands raised, and the apostles kneeling before her with their faces down. Again, it shouldn't surprise us that the later tradition is uncomfortable with this. So Wright's tradition removes the language that they knelt down with their faces down and actually changes the wording so that they too are standing. Others are just uncomfortable with the idea of her raising her hand again. So the Ethiopic edition removes all that about stretching out her hands to heaven and says instead, has her saying, I bow down before you, my Lord. So they make stuff up just to bring her in line with the humble handmaiden that the tradition has wanted to paint her as. There are several other Dormition texts that also omit Mary raising her hands in prayer. The Gospel or Questions of Bartholomew has Mary said to the apostles, let us stand up in prayer. And the apostles stood behind Mary. But she said to Peter, Peter, thou chief, thou great pillar, do you stand behind us? Did not our Lord say the head of the man is Christ? Now, therefore, stand before me and pray. But they said to her, the Lord set his tabernacle within you, and it was his good pleasure that you should contain him. Therefore, you ought to be the leader in the prayer. Then Mary stood up before them and spread out her hands toward the heaven and began to speak. In another one, Discourse of Theodosius of Alexandria, Mary asks the men to leave before she prays. In another scene in that same discourse, Mary is praying, and then later you have Jesus say, let the men go before and the women go behind. So you see again this effort to suppress her authority. Sometimes they replace Mary with Peter. So John of Thessalonica on the Dormition and the Liber Requii Dormition text, where we have in the earlier text, Mary being the one as the orans, the one doing the prayer, they replace it and have Peter as the one doing the prayer. In another Dormition text, one of the versions has Peter asking Jesus the same questions that Mary had asked him in an earlier version. So I could go on and on and on, but I think I've made my point that we have numerous and extensive examples of very clear efforts to suppress and silence and erase Mary's activity as a minister. And the reasons for doing this are, we can speculate, one is because of the ideology of masculinity, of masculine honor, which came not from the Bible, but from Aristotle. This ideology was so strong in the later centuries that interpreters just couldn't even imagine a woman having that much authority. And so their idea of reverence for the text, surprisingly, was to change it to line it up with their own theological pre-assumptions. But we now have the tools to be able to evaluate this ourselves. By the way, all along, I've been showing you pictures. Many of these are pictures from the Priscilla catacombs, where we see the very famous painting of the woman with what looks to be a Jewish prayer shawl, lifting her hands in prayer. You have women, it looks like a woman's Eucharist. All of those to this day have been dismissed by the tradition, even though you can see it right in front of you. They just can't imagine it, and so this continues to this day. I think one of the most interesting elements about Mary is this tradition of her as apostle to the apostles. The Ethiopic Liber Requii, in that book, the risen Jesus gives to Mary directly a book of mysteries and tells her to give it to the apostles. Wright does a translation of that, and he removes the entire scene in his translation. And there are others, too, that are kind of long. I don't know if I can read them all, but here's one from a Coptic Dormition fragment. We also, the apostles Peter and John, were continuing with her, fulfilling her command and her evangelic laws, while she was pilot to us all, like a wise captain. Another interesting gospel is the Protevangelium of James, or the infancy gospel of James. This is a very early 2nd century gospel that is actually a gospel about Mary, not James. And in this gospel, Mary is a Samuel figure. She is a child of promise. God reveals, the angel reveals to her parents that she will be born, and then, just like Samuel, they give her up to be raised in the temple. Now, we know this didn't happen historically, but what I'm more interested is the way that the writers of this gospel constructed the story so that there would be no doubt the connection between Samuel. And as we know, Samuel was a great prophet. So it turns out that we have a lot of references to Mary as prophet, priest, liturgist, healer, exorcist, apostle to the apostles. But if we look closely, it turns out that there's some interesting evidence within the Gospels if we use the right tools to find them. So let's turn now to the Gospels. First thing I want to preface my words with in this section is that we are trained not to notice things about Mary. Part of the way ideologies work is they set up a way of knowing that we fall into unthinkingly, and therefore, even those who are subordinated in an ideology get trained to look through the eyes of the dominant class. So that in this case, we're dealing with gender, with men and women. Even we women get trained to look through the eyes of the men. So a good example is, one of the easiest examples is in Genesis 3, when the serpent is talking to Eve. And we all grew up with Sunday school materials where the serpent tempts Eve, and then Eve goes and tempts Adam, right? But if you read it right there, and it's in the Hebrew as well, if you can read Hebrew, it says that Eve took the fruit and she gave it to Adam, who was with her. So that means that Adam was there all along listening to the same spiel that the serpent was giving Eve. And yet our Sunday school, our sermons have set us up to not see that. And we could read that over and over again, and our eyes will just go right over it. We've also been set up not to see a lot of evidence about Mary's agency. One of the most striking that is beginning to result in people's getting their eyes open is the Magnificat, Mary's famous prayer in Luke chapter 1. There, Mary is a prophet. She's remembered as a prophet. This is a prophecy. It is no different than Zechariah's prophecy later in Luke 1. She calls for the powerful to be brought down and the lowly to be brought up. She sees it as a time for Israel's restoration. It's political. And yet, our history has told us it's a story of a humble handmaiden. And we have not been able to have eyes to see the political nature of Mary's prophecy. But here you have Luke remembering her and enshrining her in the canon of Scripture as a prophet. Another fascinating little piece of information is that she was involved in an early itinerant ministry traveling with Jesus. And here again, we're trained not to look at it, but this hint that we get in the Gospel of John is supported by the later literature. And we see in John 2 the story of the wedding of Cana. And she's there along with Jesus' disciples. What's interesting is that the first day Jesus is in Bethany. The next day he goes to Galilee. The third day he goes to the wedding with his mother and his disciples. And then when he went to Capernaum, in John 2, verse 12, his mother and his brothers itinerated with him. So most of us think of the story of the wedding at Cana as sort of happening before Jesus' ministry, and it's just sort of a family thing, and Mary has to be there. No, she is possibly even leading this itinerant ministry that Jesus is part of, which makes that story make a lot more sense when she speaks so authoritatively to him about changing the water into wine. Now, I mentioned earlier that I'm going to argue that the Gospel of Mark does not like Mary. And interestingly, Mark gives no record of this early ministry in Nazareth. He waits until John is arrested. Then he has Jesus go straight to the region of Galilee near the sea. But then Matthew and Luke, they have to edit Mark. And they're writing later, and they're part of a tradition that honors Mary and honors where she came from. And so they put Nazareth back in. When they're editing Mark's material that has no mention of Nazareth, Matthew slips in a little mention of Nazareth. This shows us again that these later editors, especially Matthew and Luke, are working with Mark to rehabilitate Mary because Mark has put her in a very strange light. We'll talk about the implications of that towards the end. What this tells us is that Jesus had this early ministry in Nazareth, and his mother traveled and ministered with him, that Mark erases that early ministry, and then Luke and Matthew restore it. Mary was a threat to Mark, and Mark's gospel does everything it can to discredit Mary. First, as I mentioned, the gospel erases this early itinerant ministry with Mary and Jesus. Secondly, chapter 3, the entire chapter is set up to associate Mary with all sorts of negative signifiers. So you have an interesting story where you have Jesus, a passage that said his own came to him. Usually his own, there's some debate, but the consensus is that his own refers to Jesus' family. In Mark 3, 20 and 21, you have his own who come to him, and they say that he is beside himself. There's a lot of reason why you could actually translate that word as that he is actually in error. Then you have the accusation where the scribes come from Jerusalem to accuse Jesus of of carrying out his miracles through the power of Beelzebul. Then you have a final little narrative where Mary is named in 3:31 through 35. His mother and his brothers and sisters come to him. And this is when he says, "Who is my family but those who..." But he looks around and he re-signifies kinship, those who are his followers there, do the will of God. So what Mark has done is what scholars call an interpolation, an intercalation, or sometimes just call it a sandwich. And I've sort of set it up here. If you can see, the middle is the sandwich meat. And scholars of Mark always argue that the middle part helps you to interpret the two outer layers. They frame the story. The middle part has the elements of Jerusalem accusing Jesus of blasphemy, and here you have two family narratives framing it, which very clearly, for those who study ancient Greco-Roman modes of literature, understand this as a denigration of Mary. So Mark here has worked very hard to to reject traditional kinship and to present Jesus' mother and siblings as unbelievers. In fact, in Mark 6:4, he has Jesus say, "Prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house." And here again, Luke removes that language. Luke removes "and among his own kin," and in his own house, and Matthew removes "and among his own kin." And later in Mark it says he was amazed at their unbelief, clearly including Mary among the unbelievers. Matthew changes it to he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. Luke omits it completely. So Luke and Matthew are working very hard to removing the hostile language against Mary. Matthew removes all of the hostile language about Mary when he edits Mark. He edits out Mark 3, he rearranges the Beelzebul controversy, he removes the frame, he removes the references to the scribes from Jerusalem, he removes the double reference to the family as outsiders. Likewise, Luke removes all the threatening language about Mary as well when he edits Mark. So the first conclusion that we have is that Mary could not be ignored, whether for good or bad. Mark had to diffuse her power and her status, and Matthew and Luke had to reaffirm and restore her status. But all of them have to signify on Mary. And this is the final section that I want to talk about, the issue of signifying. So a sociologist and religious scholar, Claude Lévi-Strauss, developed a term called bricolage. And it's a term to describe how cultures work. And what Lévi-Strauss argues is that a bricolage is what he calls a cluster of seemingly unrelated and random bric-a-brac that reappear consistently around a person, a concept, or a cultural norm. And this can be a set of symbols, signs, signifiers that seemingly don't connect on any level. And yet when they come together, they create a new mythic construction that reinforces regulatory norms, and they help people do cognitive work in the world. Bricolages are kind of the way we make sense of the world, and so they're very important. And they help us understand who we are in the world and what norms that we want to privilege in the world. They help us construct meaning and values and social identity. And what I decided to do was to examine Mary through this bricolage. What is the bricolage that Mark is associating with her? What is the bricolage that Matthew and Luke and John are associated with her? What is the bricolage that gets associated with Mary in the later traditions? In the later traditions, we know virgin. I'm not saying that they don't say she's virgin, but this becomes really important. Virgin, humble, handmaid, passive. All of these get reducing her to nothing more than someone who gives birth. They've totally reduced her agency. That's the later bricolage. But what I wanted to look at was the bricolage that Mark and Matthew and Luke and John associated with her. And what I found was really interesting. I found that every one of her associates her with every one of them associates Mary with the exact same bricolage. That is, symbols, themes, or codes. And that bricolage consists of the temple, the city of Jerusalem, the characters of scribes and priests, the city of Nazareth, the notion of traditional kinship, and the 12 apostles. And what I found, for the most part, there's nuancing that you have to do, especially with John, you have to read the book to get the whole thing, is that in every one of these, you get Matthew and John I've put a thumbs down, that is, for Matthew and John, the geographic center of the temple gets re-signified in the body of Jesus. So the temple as geographic sacred space is transvalued, is no more valued. But Mark and Luke, did I say Matthew and John? I meant to say Mark and John. But Matthew and Luke see the temple in very positive lights. We can say the same thing about Jerusalem, about the scribes and priests, about Nazareth, the city of Nazareth, and you might say, well, Luke has the rejection in Nazareth. Well, this is a little tricky. They don't like the city, but they like the family. And Matthew actually makes an awkward attempt to even make the Nazareth birthplace of Jesus as a fulfillment of prophecy when he refers to Isaiah 11:1, and a branch, netzer, shall grow out of his roots, and that's what Matthew tries to say, affirms Nazareth. We know later that Nazareth had very strong connections to priestly families, and Mark and John are not in favor of any kind of priestly connections. Traditional kinship, Mark and John, thumbs down. Matthew and Luke, they revive the value of traditional kinship. And finally, the 12. In Mark, they're always getting it wrong, the 12 apostles. In John, they're just not that important. But in Matthew and Luke, Mark, they often edit Mark so that the 12 apostles are getting right. And of course, Luke places Mary and names her, the only woman named among the 12 in Acts chapter 1. So the final conclusion is one that every gospel writer signifies on Mary this very self-same bricolage as the other gospel writers, and they treat that entire bricolage either positively or negatively. No one can ignore her. Mary and Mark is associated with the scribes from Jerusalem, with traditional kinship, with Nazareth, and these are all negative associations. Mary in Matthew and Luke Acts is associated with scribes and priests, the temple, Jerusalem, priestly concerns, traditional kinship, and the apostles, but they shift and edit Mark so that these are all positive associations. Mary and John is an ambivalent character. Jesus starts out his ministry with her, and he ends the gospel with her, but John never gives her a name. And in John, she and her children do not believe and are not important for the body of John's gospel, so he doesn't seem to be concerned about traditional kinship. He resignifies the temple as Jesus' body. But in the end, when Jesus, you have this scene at the cross when Jesus says, "Woman, behold your son, son, behold your mother," he has to find a way to include her. And even that little piece of evidence in light of looking at the social scientific evidence is key, because Mary can't be ignored. So John, in essence, decides, well, we've got to co-opt her. We've got to sort of subordinate her into our narrative. With all of this, with the evidence of the later tradition showing her in all of these ministerial roles, and with the overwhelming attestation of attempts in later writings to erase her agency and leadership, and with Mary being associated with this same bricolage and the gospel writers working so hard either to discredit her or to resurrect her honor, Mary clearly is a woman to be dealt with in her own right. She did not just generate Christ, which in itself would be a reason for honor, but she generated a church. She generated a movement. She generated a new way of understanding who the people of God are. And for that, we need to honor her. We Protestants ignore Mary. The Catholics, at least, our Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions, at least retain a memory of her honor. They may think it's ascribed honor because she gave birth to Christ, but nevertheless, they honor her. We need, as Protestants, to begin to honor Mary, not for what people say about her, but for what she did, for what she earned. Thank you.
For some of us, this presentation was something that was very challenging, maybe even doubtful. For some of us, it was maybe affirming of women in ministry. But for whatever your conclusion is in your reflection, in the words of Dr. Higuera Smith, Mary cannot be ignored. So if we could have some questions now. We have Dr. Winslow and Dr. Oak also up in the Q&A section where they will give appropriate responses to the presentation depending on the question or questions that are being asked.
Is there any speculation as to why Mark did not like Mary?
Yeah, I am able to develop that more in the book. Because you have these different social signifiers of identity, their treatment towards Mary also tells us much about their social identity. And it looks like the people that would have read or found Mark's book helpful would be a different kind of people than those who read and found Matthew and Luke helpful. They would be people who did not look to the priesthood, the traditional priesthood, for any authority or see any value in the scribal tradition. They may have been, it may be a rural versus urban kind of environmental difference. It may be those who are far from Jerusalem, more of a peasant society who don't find in the elites of Jerusalem any kind of value. But what's interesting is as you get into this and looking how they treat Mary, then it reinforces some research that's been around a long time. There's been a lot of research on Mark's hostility towards the 12 and towards, usually they've argued in the past that it's towards James. But much of it has been dismissed because some of it came out of mid-20th century German scholarship where you had a lot of anti-Jewish thought, and the argument was that they were motivated, that these scholars were imposing their own anti-Jewishness onto Mark. But also they've only asked theological questions rather than social scientific questions. So once you do that, what emerges to me is it's a non-elite culture. The people who found Mark's gospel compelling, that just did not want to have a connection with Jerusalem, whereas Matthew's and Luke's traditions very much strongly connected. And it makes sense. Think of the book of Acts. One of the other research questions I had was, why does Galilee just drop off the map when you get to Acts? Did anybody else ever wonder about that? I mean, here you are, you got all these thousands of people in Galilee that are following Jesus everywhere, and then you get to Acts, and it's like, what happened to all of them? They disappeared. Everything shifts to Jerusalem. And you had this notion of Jerusalem as a site of sacred space. So yeah, there's a lot more that comes out of this research than just thinking about Mary.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question based on that, about dating. So you're talking about Mark possibly, or you're arguing that Mark is erasing, or or has a very negative view of Mary. And why I see, and you make a convincing case of the negative portrayal of Mary, is it possible that rather than maybe redacting more positive portrayals of Mary, that tradition develops post-Mark and Paul, I presume, because Paul also does not talk about Mary and utilize Mary in the way that we see later in later traditions.
Yeah, Paul. So
my first question is Mark erasing Mary's significance as a formidable figure, or is possibly Mark working on a tradition, using a tradition that does not have a high that does not perceive and uphold Mary as highly as we have in later traditions.
My sense is that Mark is drawing from a tradition that doesn't see value with Mary, because Mary is associated with those guys at Jerusalem and the apostles and the priests and all of that. And so they don't like Mary, and they don't like the social world that she stands for. But, you know, that's where the debate will probably go forward on, yeah.
I have a quick comment on Galilee. I went through recently the endings of all the Gospels, what they did afterwards, after the crucifixion, after the resurrection. I think it's John, we're the only one where they end up in Galilee. I didn't recently look that up, but in one Gospel, I think John, they go back to Galilee. But the others, they don't. They're in Bethany or Jerusalem.
Well, Luke especially, I believe in Matthew they go back to Galilee, but Luke this is again, led me to ask these research questions, because there's no returning to Galilee in Luke. You know, Galilee is not sacred space for Luke. And Luke, you know, it's all about Jerusalem now. So yeah, even the treatment of Galilee by these Gospels reinforces the claim that you have debates about sacred space, yeah.
Hi, I loved the lecture. And something that it reminded me of is I've talked to a lot of Catholics about the importance of Mary, and something that they maintain a lot is her virginity after marriage. And what they point to with that is they point to a specific word used, referring to James and like other people who they see as like Jesus' brothers and sisters, and they say that that word is the same word used as kin, so like cousins. I just want to know what your response to that, and like what your response to like Mary's maintained virginity is.
The notion that Mary was perpetually virgin. The way you're going to handle that is the way your tradition wants to handle it, because kin is an ambiguous word. So those traditions that want to see her as perpetual virgin will see her as perpetual, and those that don't will see, you know, you can't prove it. When you're dealing with ancient history, you can very rarely prove things. You're dealing with plausibilities. I find it more plausible that she went ahead and had children afterwards, but I can't prove it. You know, so you're dealing with plausibilities. That said, and it's really beyond the purview of my book, but it really is fascinating how the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century church focus on virginity, which really comes from Eastern notions of the body as a tomb, you know, Neoplatonic notions, how much those get put on all sorts of ancient female characters. I mean, the need to reduce women to either being virgin or being mother or being, you know, of course Mary is both, is freighted with cultural weight, because it's ways that the tradition can maintain control and regulation of the women's bodies. Yeah, so even the heavy focus on Mary, almost reducing her to virgin. I mean, what do we do when we talk about her? She's the Virgin Mary, you know, even in our reference to her. Does some work, cultural work in the world in terms of controlling women's bodies, yeah. Mm-hmm.
In the first chapter of Acts, there are 2 meetings in the upper room.
That's right.
One, the remaining 11 apostles, and in that group is Mary, the mother of Jesus, and
right.
and his brothers, and some other women. And then there's a second group, a group of 120, mm-hmm. 120, and evidently they are potential apostles, because they seem to be eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And furthermore, that 120 seems to include the first group. So since Mary is part of the group, we have sort of a tacit acknowledgement that Mary, the mother of Jesus, is also an eyewitness to the resurrection of her son. And as you know, being an eyewitness to the resurrection is criterion number 1 for being an apostle. So in one of the texts you showed us, I think one of the texts alluded to the fact that Mary was an eyewitness to the resurrection of Jesus. And my question is, are there any more texts like that? And if so, how early are they?
Well, one thing, thanks for the question, Dr. Waters. One thing we have to remember is that they were considered eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus, not to the actual resurrection itself, right? And but one fascinating little datum is that there are a lot of scholars who think that the Mary who was at the tomb was not Mary Magdalene, but was Mary, the mother of Jesus, or at the very least, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene were there together. There's once where it refers to Mary Magdalene, Mary, mother of James and Joseph and Salome, and it just happens that the named brothers and sisters of Jesus were James, Joseph, and Salome. So one possibility, because some later traditions, Gospels, later non-canonical Gospels, claim that Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary of Nazareth, was at the tomb, at one of the first witnesses to the resurrected Christ. If that's the case, or there's a tradition that remembers that, then that would mean that the canonical Gospels may have removed her because the story would have been less credible, possibly, if she were there. So that's kind of an interesting little possibility. Again, nothing we can prove one way or the other, but yeah, I think your point is well taken, that being in that group in Acts 1 and being named is very significant. Remember, Luke starts his gospel in the temple. Here's that temple imagery, and he ends his gospel in the temple. The very last thing they do in the in Luke is they go to the temple and pray, and then he begins Acts in the temple or in Jerusalem in the upper room, and Mary is there. And so you have Mary, she's at the beginning of Luke's gospel, this temple imagery that's associated with her. Luke uses priestly genres. Genealogies are priestly genres. Priests write genealogies. Anybody who's an Old Testament scholar will tell you that all of the genealogies that is a dead giveaway that you have a priestly community here. Mary is associated with a priestly family. There were archaeologists have found priestly writings in a list of priests that were set to go up to take their turn at the temple in Jerusalem, in Nazareth. And so you have this really fascinating connection between temple, priest, Nazareth, Jerusalem, and Mary. This was a community that treasured and honored and venerated Mary, was a priestly community, and Luke gives us evidence for that. And that by placing her there, of course, her position as apostle, as one who has witnessed the resurrected Christ, is also affirmed.
Yeah, thank you.
It's a good time for me to do my
Yes.
few brief responses. And I wanted to underline what you said about Genesis, because when the serpent's speaking, he's saying you plural, which is then again emphasized by the man who was with her. But in Hebrew, you can decide whether it's you singular or you plural, and it's you plural. And then, of course, another way we've been taught to read Genesis is to assume the serpent is Satan, when there is no Satan in the text at all. I was with my granddaughter reading one of her little books as an 11-year-old, and they quoted the exact text. The serpent was one of the creatures, the most crafty creature the Lord God had made. And then it goes on with the conversation, and the writer of the book wrote immediately under that, and the serpent was Satan. So, you're getting it young. But I wanted to talk about John 2 and expand on that, because I think it's almost a funny story where you say Jesus starts out his ministry with his mother, but John doesn't give her a name. He calls her his mother. So here's the little snippet of the story. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and me? My hour is not yet come." It's a really odd response, and it might have been cheeky, or he might have been respectful. It just sounds funny. His mother, however, didn't let that put her off in any way. She just simply turns to the servants and says, do whatever he tells you. So for me, this means Jesus submits to her demand, and she knows he will, telling the servants to do whatever he says. Is it really their affair? Well, she thinks it is, so it indicates her assertiveness and her desire to help and be in control. And it also indicates that she expects, trusts, that Jesus can and will do something about it. I mean, she expected a miracle. What else could he have done? So I think it does indicate that Jesus and his mother are clearly partners this early on. So I also have some comments about Acts, but Janette, do you want?
Yeah, Kate, you're talking about how social scientific approaches to the New Testament particularly talk about the importance of kinship and how Jesus is creating a new fictive kinship, and Paul is talking about like a society of siblings and such. And you're asking, if kinship isn't important, then why is it important? And you're giving examples in where kinship seems to matter, like James, and where Luke affirms Mary. But I'm wondering, in Matthew and Luke, is it that Matthew and Luke are affirming traditional kinship, or is it they're both sometimes affirming it and sometimes disavowing it? I think about Luke 11, I think it's 11:27 through 28, when the crowd's like, blessed is the womb that bore you and the breasts that nursed you. And Jesus says, rather, blessed are the ones who obey my word, hear my word and obey it. And here you have there both this saying it's not just the birthing that matters. It's not just that my mother birthed me, but it's women or people who obey and hear and obey my word. And so I see there both taking place.
Good. Yeah, I think it would be fair to say that traditional kinship still is very important for Matthew and Luke, but that is not to say that they don't see Jesus as expanding the kin group. But that's very different than what I see in Mark, where Jesus is rejecting the family. In Mark 3, the family are outsiders. They're standing outside, and whereas the disciples are inside. So you have this very strong geographic contrast between the family and Jesus. And just the very fact that Matthew's and Luke's Gospels begin with a genealogy. A genealogy demonstrates a concern with kinship. So if you have, now the question that it leads us to, and here again we can have debate, which one represents, the historical Jesus, I mean, was Jesus hostile to kinship, as Mark wants to traditional kinship, as Mark wants to put it, or did Jesus affirm traditional kinship but just expand its boundaries, as Luke and Matthew want to claim it? That'll be the follow-up debate that we could have. And, I mean, my inclination is to lean on the side of Luke and Matthew, but I think a strong argument could be made the other way as well.
Yeah, only one person could be his mother and breastfeed him, so he expands it. And then it also says biology is not destiny. You're doing the will of God is your destiny as a follower. Right. On Acts, Dr. Waters brought this up. You mentioned Luke places Mary with the 12 in Acts 1. Clearly, and indeed he does, and a few verses later, the Holy Spirit falls. So all of these were constantly devoting themselves to prayer together with certain women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, as well as his brothers, which actually gets to your question too. And then a few verses later, they were all together in one place, and suddenly from heaven, the Holy Spirit descended, tongues of fire and all that. So C.S. Lewis has an interesting little article. He wrote it in 1948, so a long time ago, but he insists that women cannot be priests because Mary was not there, completely ignoring Acts where she clearly was there. And then his main reason for disavowing women as priests in the Anglican Church was that God is masculine. And no one, not even a male, can be masculine enough to truly represent God, but especially women cannot be masculine enough to represent God. So it's a little disappointing when many of us like C.S. Lewis and some of the other things he says.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we know in the Syriac church, all of the liturgies, Syriac is a cognate language with Hebrew and Aramaic. It has a similar grammar. And in Hebrew and in Syriac, the word spirit is a feminine noun. So in the Syriac liturgies that have been translated into English all the way into the 4th century, the Spirit is referred to as a she constantly. The Spirit, the third person of the Holy Trinity, is female.
And we also know that the reference to God as male or female are anthropomorphic, and it doesn't mean that God is male and or female, that God has no gender in many ways. And so to argue something on the gender of God is faulty from the beginning. And I think one of the things that you're saying, going back to the whole notion of kinship, is not only is Mary, James, and Jesus's siblings, or plausible siblings, kin by biology, but they seem to be kin, from your presentation, very much so by bringing the understanding of Jesus and Jesus' role as a prophetess and protagonist. So it really not only, Jesus is not only expanding the notion of kinship through Matthew and Luke as biological, but also through this relationship with God and Jesus, which is embodied in Mary. And I think that's the powerful story that you're telling us here.
It's really kind of inspiring when you read some of the Dormition narratives, because you have people who are worshiping Jesus and Mary, you know. And I had always assumed that the worship of Mary came out of goddess traditions that get imposed onto, but in the Dormition traditions, and these are later, it's possible, that is possible, but they are, and we'd have to look a lot more carefully, but they are certainly giving a very high status to Mary, almost alongside of her son.
And
Remind us the dates of the Dormition, the century.
Well, this one that has these striking languages from the 5th century. But here again, we don't have anything earlier that we can look to except well, we do have some various documents, and some of them have pros and cons. You know, I named several of the other documents. Some of them are a little bit early, 4th century. Protevangelium of James is 2nd century. And so it's little bits and pieces, but we don't have a really strong piece of evidence until we get to the 5th century. Yeah.
I know that a lot of your past work has dealt with engaging the evangelical church.
Yes.
And so I'm curious, with the research that you are presenting here, where in the evangelical church do you hope to see change with the research? Would the individuals be people who accept the ideology and want to change their perspective on this particular issue, or work on changing the ideology slowly altogether, or is it to affirm people who hold on to the ideology but already affirm women in ministry, or another category?
Well, I don't know that I'm writing this book to the evangelical church, even though that's been my work in the past. I think Catholics will be very interested in it as well. So I can't say that I've given a lot of thought about the evangelical church per se. However, so I'm just speaking off the top of my head now. But my hope is that these claims to reinforce gender hierarchies in ministry, I see them as really damaging. I see them as sin, to be honest. I see them as horrifically destructive for the gospel of Jesus Christ being proclaimed throughout the world. I see them as silencing voices that are gifted to proclaim, voices like Mary's. I see them as reinforcing a notion that ultimately constructs a value system on those people that were created in the image of God. So in a variety of ways, I see gender hierarchy as extremely damaging to the church and to our witness to the world. And I would hope that this would be one piece of a lot of efforts on a part of a lot of people to say, wait a minute, these presuppositions that gender hierarchies are built upon, if you take them one by one, they collapse. And this is just one of those presuppositions of many. This presupposition is that women in the earliest Jesus groups did not function as ministers. And that's just false. There's just tons of evidence, not only about Mary, but about other women as well. So I would hope that that one little piece of the puzzle, the Jenga game, would be pulled out and destabilize that ideology. Yeah.
And I hope it would have a big impact on the Catholic Church, because their reason for not ordaining women goes back not to the masculinity of God like it did for C.S. Lewis, but to the maleness of Jesus and the 12 apostles, insisting Jesus did not select female apostles, when actually Mary Magdalene, or the other Mary, the one in John 20, was sent out. That is the meaning of apostle. She is the first literal witness to the resurrection, the resurrected Christ, and she is to be a witness to the men that became the apostles.
I agree with all four of you women, and I appreciate you all very well. But I want to play devil's advocate here. You know, I agree, Kay, fundamentally with what you're saying. Ken brought the piece in Acts that a criteria for apostleship, the replacement of the replacement of Judas. The first criteria is that they have to be witnesses. But there's also a footnote there, male, right? In that text, it has to be a male. So that little piece of criteria also eliminates women as the possibility, as one possible choice for the replacement of Judah, right? So many have seen that to say, okay, there are other things like the resurrection, we call upon that to say, if Jesus can send out a woman to be go tell, what is go tell if not go preach, right? That's the biggest of everything. The woman is the one that announced the resurrection, otherwise the guys will not know. Anyway, but why is it that we find in Acts, even though a criteria for replacing Judah was the folks who are candidates must have been with Jesus from the beginning, yet it made maleness an important qualification to that?
Good question. Remember that Luke Acts is a tradition that, like Matthew, that affirms priestly and Levitical traditions, that affirms it does not imagine a whole new religion. It very much imagines the Jesus movement as operating as the 12 apostles being the 12 regents of a newly reconstituted Israel. And so actually their Jewishness or their Israelite ethnic identity is more fundamental than their maleness. And it's always been interesting to me that those people who are saying women can't be in ministry because the 12 apostles were all men, well, those people are not disqualifying anybody for not being Jewish, when in fact, why? Because it's not in their interest to do it. It's not in the interest of Gentile men to focus on their Israelite nature. It's right, and so they ignore that part and focus all on the gender. The symbolism of the 12 apostles being the regents of the reconstituted 12 tribes of Israel, all of whom originally were male. Those at least the eponymous ancestors of the 12 tribes is what's crucial there. But also in Acts, you have Prisca, you have women that are operating in Acts. Prisca is Priscilla, and Aquila, who teaches Apollos, who was Paul's pastor in Corinth. So we also have others beyond the 12. We have Barnabas mentioned as an apostle, and Paul mentioned as an apostle. So Luke doesn't limit apostleship to the 12, but he does have a category of the 12, and that is, in my view, a desire to maintain this connection with the 12 tribes of Israel. Yeah, but that is no reason to withhold ministry from women. Unless, if you're going to do it, then you better throw all the Gentile men out of the pulpit too. Be consistent.
And Paul didn't let the criterion of being an eyewitness, didn't keep that from him
Paul was
calling
also
himself
an
an
apostle.
apostle. Speaking of Paul, what about Paul? He doesn't really talk about Mary, except that Jesus was born of a woman.
Yeah, that's his only reference to Mary. So it looks like he's kind of on the ambivalent side as well. Also remember that Paul was just barely veiled politeness towards James, right? I mean, he talks about, well, there are those people and they say they're important. God chooses that. I'm not really impressed. So he has to acknowledge James's authority, but he does it very grudgingly and uncomfortably. So Paul is much closer on the Markan side, as the tradition has noted, that he's a little less comfortable with James's family claims to authority.
And I hate to repeat this question again, but does it have to do with dating? Like an earlier tradition that gets developed with a higher view of Mary that comes later,
Well,
as you see the later documents that you cited?
Yeah, I mean,
Versus
that
it being an animosity
that could be an argument. In other words, our earliest sources, Mark and Paul, are ambivalent towards the family, and later sources are more positive. On the other hand, you have these Gospels that are written decades later, referring to characters and events that happened early. So you still have a tradition that Paul acknowledges of James having very high status. That's early, right? And so it's a hard question. I mean, I think the argument could be made. The difficulty, though, is how harsh Mark is. Remember, it's not just associating Mary's family with the scribes of Jerusalem and naming Mary first, right? Naming Mary is the only one named. Think about that. If it were, this is one of the ways where gender causes us to just gloss over it. Mm-hmm. If it were a male that was named, there would be no doubt that that was the object of his ire. But because it's a female, we tend to dismiss it. So we have to check that in ourselves. Mm-hmm. Secondly, remember in chapter 6 with the Nazareth rejection scene where Jesus says a prophet is not without honor among his own kin, he names them as flat out unbelievers, as does John too. So, it is the next argument that needs to be made, and I think the follow-up exploration, where is this coming from? Who's first in this? Or are they, I happen to think that they're developing sort of at the same time, two traditions that are developing at the same time. But Paul himself gives evidence that with his discussion of James, that kinship has become an important value signifier. And in fact, Eusebius, the church historian, claims that after James died, another relative of Jesus became the Bishop of Jerusalem. So there you have, again, a very, very strong tradition reinforcing traditional kinship.
And Paul is mixed because he's early on, he's writing earlier than the Gospels, but he doesn't know everything that connected to Jesus. He doesn't mention women as witnesses to the resurrection when he lists witnesses in 1 Corinthians 15. And we know from the Gospels, which are later, that the women were witnesses to the resurrection, but Paul either didn't know it or doesn't mention it. But he has plenty of women co-workers that he's not in the least bit shy about speaking to, addressing, thanking, and working with.
Mm-hmm. Well, that even could be evidence, sort of negative evidence for Mary of Nazareth being at the resurrection. If Paul is hostile or ambivalent towards the family of Jesus and Mary in particular, and if she was remembered at Paul's time as one of the first witnesses to the resurrection, it would make sense why Paul would want to leave her out.
Mm-hmm. I just have a question. You were referencing Agnes Lewis's Transitus Mariae?
Yes, Transitus Mariae. Yeah.
So when was that written in comparison then to Wright, which you also referenced, saying that he wrote
Yeah.
things out and she left it in? So, and could there have been some bias with those two translators?
Well, hers is earlier. So the one she's translating is from the 5th century, and the one that Wright was translating is from, I want to say the 7th. I might be wrong on that. I didn't write that down. I believe it's the 7th century. So it's a later text that Wright is dealing with.
Okay, I get it. I thought you meant Wright left it out, but he actually was looking at a later text.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I should clarify. Yeah, it's not Wright himself who left these things out. The 7th century text left them out, and he translated that. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Kay, for gracing us with your decade of research. It's both enlightening in terms of being a female in leadership, as well as recognizing some of the traditions in which we get ourselves caught. So thank you so much for disavowing some of those things that catches us or represses us or sublimates us.